Thank you for joining us for this month's MCC webinar. It's a behind the scenes look at MCC's work. We have people joining us on Zoom and also via Facebook Live from multiple countries. And I give greetings to each of you. Saludos a todos y todas. Thank you for your ongoing support of MCC and your interest in this work. We are thrilled to have you as part of the MCC story. I'm glad that we can offer you this unique way of a unique view of the way we serve in the name of Christ. My name is Ann Graber Hirschberger, and I serve as MCC US's Executive Director. And today I'll be your host for this webinar. I'm here in Akron, Pennsylvania, in the United States, at the MCC US offices. Just a few logistics here as we get started. On Zoom, participants will be kept muted throughout the webinar. And if you'd like to submit a question via Zoom, please do so through the Q&A function, not the chat. Si prefiera escuchar esa presentación en español, puede ir al globo, al icono abajo de la pantalla, donde dice interpretación, y haga clic. Ahí puede escoger español. People who've joined via Facebook are encouraged to submit questions also through the Facebook comment section, and someone is monitoring those during this hour. You can submit questions at any time during the webinar, but we would hope that you kind of would get some going so that we can collect them throughout the presentation. We'll try to address as many questions as we can, but with this size of group, we may not have time, likely won't have time to get all of the questions during the webinar. We're recording the session, and the recording of the webinar will be made public following this live presentation. So let's get going. The topic is migration for human dignity. For more than 100 years, MCC has worked with people on the move. And our goal is to affirm people's right to go and their right to stay. This topic is deeply meaningful to me personally through my years of MCC service and also outside of service living in Virginia, from working with hundreds of displaced persons in camps in El Salvador, being part of agonizing decision-making on the part of families trying to decide whether to leave, to try to make a better life for their families and be safe, or to stay where everything is familiar. To, on the other side, for several weeks, hosting a family of 9 who came directly from a refugee camp and could not find housing large enough for their family. And so we learned what it was like to move from cooking over the fire to cooking on a stove. I care deeply about these questions. Our presenters will each speak for about 7 to 10 minutes, and then we'll have 30 minutes for questions and feedback. And again, we encourage you to submit your questions, and we'll answer as many as we can. Now I'm pleased to introduce Bonnie Claussen and Anna Vogt, our presenters this evening. Bonnie Claussen is the MCC Area Director for South America, Mexico, and Cuba. She's originally from Waterloo, Ontario in Canada, and her past experience includes service as MCC representative in Colombia for almost 10 years, and with an MCC partner organization there, Justa Paz, for 5 years. Bonnie currently lives in Bogota, Colombia, with her husband and 15-year-old son. Welcome, Bonnie. Anna Vogt is the director of MCC Canada's Peace and Justice Office. She grew up in Dawson City, Yukon, and she also previously served with MCC in Colombia, first as a participant in the SEED program, and then in communication and advocacy. And she's currently working from her home in Ottawa. Welcome, Anna. I will turn this over to the two of you.
Great, thank you, Anne. We're so glad to be here with you all and to get to talk about a topic that we're all really passionate about, just like Anne mentioned. and talking about especially migration and migration for human dignity. Our focus is on the right to stay and the right to go. So we want to share some stories from Latin America, ways that MCC is responding and working, and ways that you can join us in that work. But before we do that, we recognize that migration is a huge part of so many of our stories, including many of the people on this call, and that you all have expertise and wisdom to share around the question of why do people migrate. So I'm actually just going to share a link in the chat. You should just get it there. And I'm going to start sharing my screen to a word cloud feature, where if you visit that link, you will have the chance to respond to this question, thinking about people you know, your own family history, and the general context of migration. Why do you think people migrate? So I invite all of you to find the link in the chat. It should be right there for you. And go ahead and start entering some words that you feel describe this context. Again, thinking about the people you know, your own experiences, your family history, and general context of migration. Why do you think that people migrate? Let me just refresh the page to see if hopefully some words are popping up. Here we go. Hope for a better life. Yes. Freedom from persecution. We have safety here. Jobs. Thinking about violence, another reality. And fear. Safety. That's really connected to those other two words that were mentioned. Environmental destruction. Violence. You can see a lot of people are sharing that answer. Natural disaster. That's really connected to environmental destruction. Education, moving for something, looking at perhaps a better life, opportunities. We have jobs there as well. Economic benefits, closely connected to jobs. Future for kids, families, thinking about another reason why people migrate or move. Let's get a few more and then we'll move on. Poverty. Great, yeah, these are some, and our presentation, this is really helpful. Our presentation is going to touch on a number of these different topics. So it's good to see, again, the wisdom in this room and the expertise that we have around the topic of migration and the variety of reasons, the spectrum of reasons of why people migrate and how their journey looks like. So I'm going to stop sharing. And Bonnie, if you want to start sharing your screen again and continue.
Great. So, just a second. So yes, as we're already thinking about migration, thinking about people in our lives and our families that have migrated, I'm sure that different people and images and stories come to mind. MCC and LACA has many faces of migration that we're always thinking about. We think about the faces of millions of internally displaced people in Colombia who have fled because of violence, because of the armed conflict, like the campesino that you see in the middle of the screen there. We also think of people like Patrick, a young man from Cameroon who, to avoid persecution, fled to one of the few countries he could go to without a visa, which was Ecuador, then walked and traveled in different ways north until he came to a migrant shelter in Mexico City that we support and has now stayed in Mexico City. There's also the faces of many young Hondurans who have migrated to the United States and then been deported back, hopes shattered. The Honduran Mennonite Social Action Committee accompanies them and teaches them job skills to help them find a future again after that experience. We, of course, love the smiling face of Vicky Mamani, a Bolivian woman who migrated to the big city of El Alto when work in the countryside dried up. And she tries hard to keep growing vegetables, to keep on holding on to her farmer roots, even in the city. And we truly seek to remember the faces of thousands of migrants who die on the journey. Die due to a lack of basic conditions, die because of harsh policies that only allow the strongest to survive. we repeat the names of those that have died, for example, in the Arizona desert.
Then when we think about migration, and especially migration in Latin America, I find it helpful to remember that migration isn't something that's new. Migration has always been part of the world that we live in, and Latin America is no exception. People have migrated for centuries. I think of our own family history, my family history of moving from Russia to Canada. People have migrated for centuries, sometimes in harmful ways and sometimes in helpful ways, in ways that have benefited or harmed communities where they arrive or end up. When I think of Latin America, I also think of histories of colonization and of the devastating impacts of the arrival of the Spaniards in the 1500s, and then also slavery, the forced displacement and relocation of people from Africa, and how that has also shaped the region, including our own countries of Canada and the US in multiple ways. And then I also think of the many indigenous communities throughout Latin America that share connections and languages, culture and tradition that often crosses the borders, that political borders that are established. And then I also think that as we look at the present today, as we move into our current reality in migration, there's a spectrum around forced and voluntary migration, of people being displaced from their land to people choosing to leave for better jobs or education. As Bonnie mentioned, there are many people in the region who are internally displaced, refugees in their own countries, and people who migrate between borders. Think of many young people, especially, who end up leaving behind a rural life to move to the city. That urbanization is another form of migration. And of course, armed conflict is also another reality that shapes forced displacement with and outside of political borders. Just recognizing that the role that migration continues to play in this region.
So in response to all these pressures that push people to migrate and may pull them to new places because of family or opportunities or just where they can go, people are always making choices. In this picture here, we see a Colombian Mennonite Brethren church leader, Rutilio Rivas. And with others in his church, they decided a number of years ago to take some very bold steps to help communities around them stay outside of the illegal economies, outside of the armed groups that are pressuring their region, outside of the violence. But as a result of their work, on multiple occasions, members of the armed groups have threatened Rutilio and his colleagues, and threats with big guns in hands, that death is imminent kind of situations. They're threatened because the work of the church is interfering with violence and interfering with economic interests. But Rutilio has refused to cooperate with these armed groups, and he has also refused to leave. He has chosen not to dig up his roots. He has chosen not to leave his family and his culture. He has chosen not to abandon his life project. We find that very inspiring, and we want to continue to support all those efforts to build community projects that make life viable. But the risks are very real. Many other people in these communities have been killed, have been massacred. We who are safe can't tell them, well, just try to stay where you are. By the time people are dead, it's too late. People need choices. And I always ask myself, is there really a difference between quick death from a bullet or slow death, not only for yourself, but also for your children when putting food on the table becomes impossible? So here in this picture, we see a farmer who precisely was working with the MB agricultural project, trying to grow rice, trying to grow cacao, trying to do things outside of the illicit economy, outside of the armed groups. But his rice and all the water sources around him were fumigated with chemicals as part of the US-backed war against drugs. What do families do when they lose everything? What do they do when there's no safety nets? Migration is an option. It should be, it could be. This is a scenario in Colombia, but it's the same scenario again and again all over Latin America in hundreds of communities. Maybe it's fumigation that forces them out. Maybe it's a hurricane. Maybe it's a drought. The story continues again and again.
So I'd like to move us to Central America and share two stories. A longer story introducing you to Jose Hernandez, the farmer featured in this picture. He's a Mayan man, an indigenous man, a farmer from the community of Zapote in Guatemala, a community where migration, often forced, is part of the fabric of the community these days. His community suffered the impacts of genocide and conflict and internal displacement in the 1990s. Currently, there are many of the same forces that Bonnie mentioned that pressure on the community to migrate on Jose Hernandez, including a changing climate that makes farming more difficult as weather patterns change and become unpredictable. And another factor, Bonnie, next slide, please, that is always present in the community as well is the presence, and this is where our countries connect with one another, is that the community of Zapote and many of the surrounding communities have also been deeply impacted by the presence of a Canadian mining company, Goldcorp. At one time, one of the largest open sky and open pit gold mine in the world. The presence of the mine contributed to the destruction of social fabric, water contamination, again, combined with the changing climate, making farming more difficult, leading to a loss of land and displacement. There were many concerns by the community over a lack of free, prior, and informed consent, that the communities didn't feel like they had the ability to speak into the activities that were taking place on their land. Even with the temporary jobs that were provided by the mine, the negative long-term impacts of the mine are deeply felt and can be seen in people migrating and leaving the region behind. And one remarkable fact about the community when I was visiting was that it was mainly women who were present during the visit. Many of the men had migrated to southern Mexico or further north towards the US. Many people in the community could talk about family members living in other parts of either Latin America or further north. Some migrating just seasonally where there were jobs available, others migrating more long-term. Once again, creating ruptures in the social fabric, and many people seeing migration as the only solution to deal with economic instability. MCC in the region partners with a church-based organization called Pastoral de la Tierra. This organization works with the community on a variety of concerns related to migration, especially related to forced displacement. They work to provide community members with more choice around what they do with their lives. Encourage and teach permaculture. Here you can see Jose Hernandez standing in front of actually his compost pile, where he's working with worms to encourage healthy soil and different ways of farming to mitigate some of the impacts of climate change, using traditional indigenous knowledge, which of course allows more options for staying present. And by drawing community members together to work together around agriculture, the MCC partner also supports the community in organizing and advocacy around the presence of mining companies. These traditional practices, here you can see a weaving workshop, encourage the restoration of social fabric, encourage community level advocacy and peace building as other options that allow the communities more choice about what they do with their lives. And this is often accompanied and supported by MCC advocacy in Canada around accountability for Canadian companies. And all of these different components take place to try to encourage and allow people to have more choice around their lives and their own mobility. And then I'd like to share one quick example of another form of migration, of someone who was actually on their journey that I met when I was in southern Mexico. And I just like to read the words on the screen here from a young woman I met, a young mother named Maria from El Salvador, again, that I met at a migrant shelter in southern Mexico. And she told her story that I'm a single mother sharing a home with another mother. Between us, we have 11 children. When gang members approached us and demanded that we give them our teenage daughters, we refused and turned to the police. The next day, the police arrived at our home and gave us 24 hours to hand our children over to the maras, or gang members. And so we left, and here we are. And this story, again, serves as a reminder to me of the realities of forced displacement in urban settings, as well as the bravery of many people in the midst of impossible choices, risking everything for themselves and their families.
Sorry. Some of these situations are very overwhelming. And as MCC workers, as MCC as an organization, we are very grateful to be able to work with local partners that are doing brave and remarkable things accompanying migrants. How are communities of faith responding? There are many examples that I could share. I want to start out by telling about the Mennonite church in Riohacha, Colombia. It's near the Venezuela border, and to give a little bit of context, there's currently around 5 million Venezuelans that have left their country looking for viable living conditions somewhere else in the region. And the Riohacha church is on the path that many of these migrants will pass through on their way somewhere. And some of these migrants certainly stay in this town. The pastor in this church is a very energetic 70-year-old woman named Maria de Melo. She is the woman there in the middle of the screen with the black blouse who's lifting up a young girl. And yes, she is energetic enough to outshine Angelina Jolie, who's standing beside her. For years, Maria de Melo has run a home for abandoned elderly people in her town, and she has the volunteer support of many women in the church and other people in the community. When Venezuelan migrants began to steadily pass through the town and ended up sleeping in the park or in the street or anywhere, Maria de Melo began to actively look for ways to open up the doors of the church. Initially, the Colombian elderly who were already living in this home were a little bit crusty, a little bit unsure about the migrants, and that reflected the prevailing political climate towards Venezuela at the time. But the giggles and the games of the little Venezuelan children soon turned the original inhabitants into doting adopted grandparents. The migrants became family for these abandoned elderly people. I love this program because the church has become a place of connection here. It's transforming stereotypes. It's removing barriers just by virtue of being together. MCC provides funding for daily food and other supplies for this program. And in our budgeting process, we've planned together with the church that it's viable to feed about 70 migrants a day, twice a day. But somehow, every time Maria de Melo reports back and says what she's doing, they're always feeding more than 100 people every day. Somehow the loaves and the fishes always multiply. You know, governments and people around the world keep closing doors to migrants, saying, oh, we don't have enough for our own. We can't have more people here. In reality, I think that most poverty around the world really isn't poverty. It's an issue of inequality. A few in this world have hoarded the world's resources as if there were not enough. The Riohacha Mennonite Church never operates out of this mentality of scarcity. They always operate out of generosity. MCC is supporting many programs like this across Latin America, church-based programs in Ecuador, Colombia, Honduras, Guatemala, Mexico. They all serve with generosity. Here in this picture, you see Beto Ramos. He's the director of a Catholic migrant shelter in Agua Prieta, Mexico, right by the Arizona border. He says, working with people that are vulnerable, I must be open to receive them. As we work with new volunteers and they interact with migrants at the shelter, their discourse begins to change from describing migrants as delinquents or criminals to learning their names and describing them, first of all, as people. MCC and MCC partners, we work with migrants because they are people.
So that brings us to the question of what are we called to do? When we hear of the generosity, of the response of receiving people as they are, of the humanity of migrants, what is our response? What is our calling? And we can think of 3 words that describe this well. We can think of hospitality, dignity, and reconciliation. Hospitality, we are people of welcome. We view every person, no matter their story, with dignity, as a person created in the image of God. And then reconciliation. How do we work to acknowledge harms and our own responsibilities and work for reparations and restore? So as MCC, when we think of these questions, there are a few guiding questions that help us as we work with migrants and worked on themes related to migration, related to those questions of the right to stay and the right to go. The first is that people need roots, that we all need a sense of belonging and a place to call home. We also believe that people need to be able to choose where they live and what they do, to not be forced to migrate or to be uprooted. And we also believe that people need dignity wherever they go, that this call to see the image of God in another person is a holy calling. And that people also need connection with one another, that migration can be a way to strengthen our global communities and to bring people together. And so these are a few questions that we ask when we think about our work on migration. Can conditions change so that people are able to stay in their communities? Thinking of the work of partners and faith communities in Latin America. How can we encourage people to grow new roots after they migrate? What are ways that we can work with people to reintegrate into communities after they arrive? Do people have choices? Do people have agency in what they're able to do with their lives? Are people being treated with dignity? Can they live with dignity? And how can we structure programs and policies that allow that to happen? And as well, are people allowed to maintain and build human connections? What is the role of community in bringing us together? And so, of course, this brings us to advocacy, which is one additional way that MCC works to respond. And these are questions that we ask around policies and bring to spaces where policies are created to help us think about how we can respond. And we work on advocacy to support people with the options to make the best choices possible for themselves, their families, and their communities, through especially advocating around the root causes of forced displacement. We have 3 offices dedicated to advocacy, working again on these themes related to addressing the root causes of forced displacement. We have the Peace and Justice Office, which advocates towards the Canadian government in Ottawa, where I'm privileged to serve with MCC. We also have an advocacy office located in Washington, DC, and then one in New York that works with the United Nations. In our offices, we engage in policy analysis. And we also try to take the stories of faith communities and partners, the stories that Bonnie and I have been sharing with you tonight, and bring these to situations of power. We encourage policymakers to question and undo policies that cause harm and engage in creating policies of reconciliation that uphold dignity, that allow people to have connections and roots. Some practical examples of themes that we advocate on are climate change, support for peace building and not for militarization, and also accountability for connections for companies that cause harm. And of course, we encourage you to join us and invite you to connect with us. We'll send an email after this webinar with an invitation to sign up for our advocacy newsletter. Every time we visit governments, we always hear from them that they want to hear the concerns of people that they represent, whether that's in the US or in Canada, and know that your voice is important in shaping policies. And so we want you to have information to be able to advocate and speak well with policymakers. So yes, you can sign up for our advocacy newsletter as well as resources around the root causes of forced displacement. And we also encourage you to connect with your regional or provincial MCC office for a variety of opportunities to engage, again, in everything from advocacy to direct involvement in supporting migrants, whether that's through refugee resettlement, through private sponsorship in Canada, work with legal services, or supporting migrant shelters in the US. And as well, we encourage you to visit the MCC Latin America blog for stories of migration and ways that, again, you can continue to connect with these stories. And yes, thank you for being present with us, for hearing these stories, and we look forward to engaging with your connections so we can dive with your questions so we can dive further into these topics.
Thank you so much, Anna and Bonnie. You have ably led us through a very, very complex part of living life, as it has been from the beginning of time, actually, with many, many reasons for migration, and have provided this picture of sort of this back and forth, the different faces of migration, but also places where we can help people make the choice to stay, places where we can support people who are on the move. Thanks a lot. We're entering a time now of questions and then we'll have conversation back with Bonnie and Anna. I will be collecting some of those questions and then passing them on to you. And as I said earlier, we might not get to all of them. Probably won't, but let's get started. There were some questions that had come in earlier, even prior to this, and some of those I think you addressed, but would like you to see if you can help us understand just a little bit more about specifically right now. There's a question about how immigration policy in the U.S. First with the earlier President Trump and now with the current President Biden, how do you see those policies affecting migration? Has that changed?
I will try to say something about that. That's a fairly complex world. And it's complex in part because in the last number of years, the details of immigration policy keeps changing.
Right.
And we have heard considerably from Custom and Border officers at the borders that they're not sure what's going on and haven't been for a few years now, and it keeps changing. So it's a whiplash of always trying to implement new regulations, which also leads to a great deal of inconsistency, as not everybody is up on what's going on next. And it makes it very difficult for legal services and migrant shelters to also know how to respond. The strategies, for example, the migrant shelters that we support along the US-Mexico border, in the last while, every month it's a different reality of what's going on because of the ever-changing policies. A few things about US policy. The previous government had done quite a few things to dismount the US's asylum processing system. Asylum seekers are people that have a legitimate fear, a reason where they simply cannot continue to live in their country and they need to go somewhere else because of fear, as a summary of all the different reasons. And the United States has agreed to be an asylum receiving country. And so all people crossing into the United States, however they cross into the United States, have a legal right to apply for asylum. But that requires a processing system, and the processing system has been undone to a large degree in the last 4 years. And the current government is starting to rebuild some of that processing system, but it is a slow process. We need that to be quickly re-put together so people can be processed in safe places, not in Mexico, but in the United States, where they can have access to legal advice, where they can be safe from armed threat in Mexico. And Mexico is not an entirely safe country for migrants. And so they need to be able to be safely processed in the United States in a timely way. Another issue related is the fact that migrants have often been criminalized or viewed as criminals, therefore put in detention center. And as you know, that has led to many issues of family separation, families being pulled apart. These are systems that are not fully put back together yet, and there's still a lot of issues with family separation that need to be sorted out. One thing that has increased, not just with the previous administration, but over quite a number of years and continues into the present with the current administration, is the militarization of not just the US-Mexico border, but also the militarization of the Mexico-Guatemala border, and now in the last year, the militarization of the Guatemala-Honduras border. So the US border is now, in all practical purposes, south of Guatemala. Migrants that try to cross into Guatemala are facing significant militarization and being blocked. However, migrants still find ways to travel. It just becomes so much more dangerous. The idea is that militarization will stop people from traveling, but they still travel. It just becomes extremely risky. They get into the hands of human traffickers or cartels or armed groups or many other threats along the way. And so we need to put an end to militarization of borders, because it's only people putting people in harm's way. One thing that is changing towards the current administration is more interest in addressing root causes of why people are migrating out of Central America. There's a proposal for a significant aid package, still under negotiation what that means. We hope that local organizations in Central America can help to shape that, so it comes from the bottom up. How can people be allowed to stay? How can they decide what helps them stay in their communities and not imposed from the top down? But the addressing of root causes is something that's now being addressed by the current administration, and we see that as something that is promising, and it will depend on how it actually is implemented.
You've painted a picture that would probably tell us that we can't read one news article and we're going to understand what's going on at the border. We can't even do a visit and understand what's going on at the border. It changes rapidly. A related question, kind of as people cross the southern border of the U.S., Mexico-U.S., question that somebody posted was then, so how do people get to the Canada border once they get into the U.S. and many people have tried to move into Canada? How do they get there? Do you know? And what happens when they get there?
Yeah, again, I think this is quite a complex question, and that there isn't just one answer in how this happens. People move in a variety of ways based on the connections that they have, the people that they know, the languages that they speak. In fact, I think due to the fact that the US border is south of Canada, Canada actually has far less people crossing the US-Canada border as the US-Mexico border. So the majority of people that migrate to Canada actually migrate through more official channels, either through refugee resettlement, where they're selected from countries where they're claiming asylum and are selected to come to Canada, or through visas, student visas. So migration in Canada is much more regulated than it is in the US. The Canada and US do share a third safe country agreement with the US, where people that want to claim asylum in Canada are not able to do that at official points of entry, and instead need to cross irregularly into Canada before they can claim asylum. But that isn't something that MCC directly works on. But MCC does try to provide spaces and ways that people are able to be treated with dignity, no matter where they are on their migration journey. And so I think for us, it's less important, perhaps, the routes that people are taking, but how are people treated? What choices do people have? How can we ensure that we can uphold people's humanity, no matter where they are on their journey?
And what choices they've made in getting there. A related question at the beginning of that journey is someone's interested in knowing what happens or who organizes the migrant caravans that sometimes we hear about being stalled different places.
Well, that is a very interesting question, and I'm not sure we actually have a perfect answer to that question. my close colleagues, the area directors for Central America and Haiti, Cesar Flores and Lisette Miranda, live in Honduras, live in San Pedro Sula, where sort of a lot of the caravans have their starting point. People go to San Pedro Sula, and then that's where they start to gather and leave. And we've talked about this many times. They have their ears to the ground. They're watching and listening, and it is not clear. It is not clear exactly how these start. Certainly social media plays a big role as people hear, and quickly messages spread to thousands and millions of people in moments. So it's not quick, it's not difficult for people. It doesn't take a lot of organizing for thousands of people to know that a caravan is going, a group of people are going to leave on such and such. It doesn't need a lot of organization for that to happen. I don't think that there is any, from all that we have heard and what we do, I don't think there's financing of these caravans. People choose to go with caravans because it is perceived as and has been safer. When people travel by themselves or in very small groups, they're much more likely to be caught by human traffickers, to be caught by any one of the different kinds of armed groups or organized crime along the way, and they're very vulnerable. And some people do pay coyotes, and that can cost $10,000 to try to travel. They may get more than one try on that amount of money, but it's very expensive to get support for traveling. And caravans have become an alternative to that, is going in a group with a large number of people where they can share with each other, work together, find resources together, and it becomes a more viable way to migrate. We have seen no evidence that somebody out there is financing this. What's a little bit unclear is exactly how do they get started each time, who starts it, but it doesn't take a major level of organization. A few Facebook chats and hundreds of people know. When people have a reason to migrate, when they feel I have no choice anymore to stay in my country, that news that there'll be a group traveling becomes attractive. It becomes a way forward. And so it's part of their choices.
Thanks. Let's move to a question more related to the advocacy side. Someone is curious to what extent the global compacts are touchstones for MCC advocacy and action, and how MCC might be involved if we are in forums such as the Global Forum on Migration and Development and the Civil Society Action Committee. Anna?
Yeah, MCC has been very involved in the past, especially on the Global Compact on Migration. This has been the work of our office in New York towards the United Nations, but especially when the Global Compact on Migration was being formed, MCC was very present and involved in that work through some civil society committees, actually also in New York, and chairing some of those committees to encourage that there was civil society participation, and voices of MCC partners were present in shaping the Global Compact on Migration. In recent years, we haven't been as involved in that work, but I do want to highlight MCC's work and the importance of these compacts as well as setting out some good policy frameworks for states to pay attention to when they're looking at encouraging people to be able to migrate in safety. Bonnie, would you have anything that you'd want to add about the development? Sorry, Anne, I've lost the development committee.
I just would add that in some countries, our local partners, for example, in Mexico, are very linked into national networks, and it's national networks that then advocate towards their country, like the Mexican government in this case, because the Global Compact for Migration, Global Compact for Refugees, it has to be implemented in practical. Now it's agreed, everybody, or not everybody, but many countries have signed. Now it has to be implemented, and that is about the political will on a practical level. So MCC has its advocacy office in Canada, the United States, and the UN office. Many of our partners do advocacy towards their governments. And our work is to, in a practical financial way, in a brainstorming way, in a networking way, support them to also advocate precisely around these kinds of compact, these kinds of agreements, these as well as other they're signatories to other commitments around migrants to make sure their governments follow through on what they've agreed to do.
There's a set of questions. Oh, go ahead, Anna. Did you have something
Yes.
else to say?
Oh, I was just going to feed off what Bonnie said and said, we can see how our advocacy work, we try to have it complement each other. That here's the work that happens in Canada and the US, and then here's the work that happens locally within different spaces as well. And we find that that leads to more sustainable change.
Thanks. Yes, it does. Each of you gave some interesting examples of partnerships where MCC supports local partners in helping people have more of a likelihood of being able to remain in their own home. People are interested. There have been a couple questions about those, and I think you gave some examples. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what are the challenges in working at that level in terms of trying to find ways for people to stay, either because of sustainability in relation to climate or violence issues where they live, or simply economics and sustainable livelihoods kinds of things. What have you seen over the years, patterns, or where does it work? Where can we most help, or what are the particular challenges in general that we have to look at as we're trying to enable people to be able to make that decision?
I think migration tends to happen in stages for many people, and not just as individuals, but as generations in a family. A few decades ago, Latin America was a very rural region. In a matter of 30, 40 years, Latin America has become the most urban region of the world. And that is a form of migration. People have found it impossible to stay in the countryside, and so they go to the city. One of the big areas of MCC LACA programming is supporting local communities, local partners, and helping small-scale farmers to stay in the countryside, growing food in a sustainable way, in a way that they can provide for their families, that they can have options, and their kids can decide to go study or not, but that farming is seen as a viable option. One of the challenges is that there are big factors like climate change, like drought and floods and hurricanes that do make that difficult, and we do not control that. So a lot of our work is moving towards mitigating the impact of climate change as droughts become longer, as flooding becomes unpredictable or rains become unpredictable. How do we help farmers to adapt? So that's a big, it tends to be a generational shift of families then moving to the city over the course of maybe 2 or 3 generations. And once they move to the city, that is a critical shift. If they cannot integrate into income generating options that are stable in the city, they will likely end up going somewhere else, either a neighboring country or trying to go north or trying to go somewhere, because the urban centers in Latin America are difficult places where there is lots of, if people don't integrate into the community, into a neighborhood, into employment in the city, there are too many illegal options of gangs, of youth violence, of other illicit activities and pressures to need to go elsewhere. So we have programs with local churches in a number of places, helping young adults integrate into their community, helping them to build up values for nonviolence, helping them to find ways to have employment, including youth that have been sent back before they migrate again. But that kind of change needs to happen on almost each person needs to find what we call in Latin America, their life project. It doesn't work to do that on a large scale. We have to do it on a small scale, which means we need to work with a network of many small scale organizations doing that.
so sometimes we get to know people who are leaders in the community. And one of the questions that came in is, so if we are friends with somebody who's in a very, very difficult economic context, should we help important leaders to migrate if that's what they want to do?
Oh, good, Anna. I'm glad you want to answer that question.
I think we want to try to ensure that MCC doesn't actively seek to provide pathways for people to migrate. That's not our job. And so and especially I think we try really hard not to advocate for individual cases, but rather on community behalf or country behalf. So looking more at the broader picture of a community and how we work to support partners who support those communities, but that it's not MCC's role to make those decisions about who should be able to migrate or not in a community, or who we should advocate for or not on an individual basis, but that we need to trust the communities to do that. But Bonnie, if there's anything you want to add to that as well.
Well, I would just make a comment that having been, you mentioned Pastor Rutilio in the beginning, and having been with him, there were a number of people on our learning tour who wanted him to leave because they wanted him as an important pastor to be safe. And he was very clear that his call, as you call it, Bonnie, his life project was to be there. It was very moving.
Right. It's difficult for MCC to take on individual cases because that every situation causes an effect for a whole community. And so we, like Anna said, we really want to work with communities and in discerning this together. And sometimes communities have discerned as a community, this person needs to leave. And when a community tells us as MCC, this person needs to leave, we take that differently and may look at ways to support this person than when an individual comes and says, I want to leave. And we don't discount if the individual wants to leave, we bless that. People need to make choices, but again, MCC works with communities, and that's a balance. It's an issue we're always trying to balance. But that is not to say that any individual on this call shouldn't help your individual friends. That is your choice as well. But there will always be ripple effects in communities, and those are difficult dilemmas.
Right.
Maybe if I can just add something as well, we absolutely think that everyone should be protected and have access to safety. And so especially when people's lives are threatened, we work to support partners who also engage in local advocacy. For example, in Colombia, we work with a number of partners who are engaging in active advocacy around community leaders who are being threatened and displaced. So we also want to take really seriously the commitment to ensure that people are protected, have safety, and again, are not in fear for their lives. And so that's something really important to consider.
Well done. Not easy. A set of questions or about that, somewhat about responding, but also broader about the church. You talked about many of the church's response in Colombia, the very particular one on the border with Venezuela, about the idea of generosity versus the scarcity, which we're so used to in the North, the feeling of scarcity or the idea of scarcity. But how? A couple of questions. One is, what are the effects on the church globally of migration, both positive and negative? That would be one. And then within the global church, what do you know about Mennonite churches? You spoke to some of the churches in Latin America, perhaps in North America as well. What do you know about how churches can help, or how MCC even supports integration processes, and what resources are available to churches and communities to be communities of welcome?
Sure, well, maybe I can start by talking a little bit about the Canadian context. specifically, and then broadening it to the global church. And I think churches often inspire me with their hospitality and their sense of welcome. In Canada, MCC actually in the 1970s advocated for a new form of refugee resettlement, private sponsorship, which allowed communities, church groups, families to actually provide newcomers, refugees, with everything that they needed for a year. And that we've really seen throughout the decades that the richness that this has contributed to Canadian society, the way that people in Canada are proud of supporting refugees and sponsoring refugees, and the changes that happen in people's communities, homes, churches, when there's connections and real sense of community with migrants. And so we've seen that to be a richness here in Canada, and the role of churches in welcoming others can be a source of hope and of new understandings of who God is and what our faith looks like when we're working on hospitality. And I think as MCC, we're really privileged to get to see that happening throughout the world in our work on migration, to see churches in DR Congo responding to Mennonites who have been displaced from other parts of the country and coming together. And just looking on our website as well to see that the stories and the richness of these connections of hospitality. And that really, again, inspires me in my own, when I think of what it means to be generous. And so I really do think that faith communities can be sources of welcome and generosity. And that's a beautiful way of seeing God's image.
We have just about 4 minutes left, and there are a couple of questions about specific people groups and places. And there, one is around Cuba, that asking what is the situation? What are the opportunities to leave? What work does MCC have in Cuba? And now with COVID, what's the status of Mennonite people in Cuba?
Yes, the situation in Cuba, I think, is the most dire situation the country has seen in many decades, since before the 1959 revolution. And I wouldn't want to peg exactly when, but it's the most dire situation the island has ever seen because of after 60 years of an embargo. It's after 60 years of being under siege, that is a challenge. Being on an island that does depend a great deal on tourism in a time of COVID, where that income from tourism is no longer there, that is a huge challenge. And again, the lack of access, not to medical knowledge, but syringes, vials, literal medical, it does make it difficult to manage the pandemic as well. MCC works closely with the Brethren in Christ Church in Cuba. There are also there are a variety of other groups, Anabaptist groups emerging. We also work with an interdenominational Christian Center for Reflection and Dialogue. And with both of these groups, we're working in increasing food production, more crop production, chickens, pigs, as well as we are working with some difficulty because of all the restrictions to send containers of canned meat as well as relief kits to Cuba in order to help respond to the literally need of, there are not things available anymore on the island. People are brushing their teeth with soap or not bathing because of a lack of basic hygiene items. There are Cubans leaving the island, and there's been an increase of Cubans that we've seen in migrant shelters in Mexico, in Central America as a result of this. But it is very difficult for Cubans to leave the island, especially now in times in COVID. That makes it extremely difficult. We are working to help Cuba also be more viable for the people that want to stay.
And if you can make a real quick comment about how MCC works with Low German Mennonites who also want to stay on their land but are often needing to move as well.
MCC in Bolivia and Mexico in particular are working with Low German communities. In Bolivia, there are a lot of communities in the Chaco region that are experienced considerable drought. And so in the Chaco region of Bolivia, we work with Low German communities in trying to adapt their conventional agricultural practices, to use drip irrigation, to plant trees in order to sustain the soil for better soil conservation, to try out new crops, diversify their production in order to make it more viable for them. And in Mexico, we are mostly focused on education work in Chihuahua and Durango. We actually have a very interesting project with the Ontario school boards at this point, helping families that migrate back and forth every year to make sure their kids can stay in school in both locations. And so that's part of the migration story.
Thank you. Anna, would you just have any final words for this good audience here today?
Well, just to thank all of you for joining and for reflecting on these stories with us. I know we've centered a lot on Latin America, but these are stories that we all share wherever we are. And I think just help us remember the connections that we share with one another.
And Bonnie?
It's been a pleasure to be able to join a group, share stories, invite ongoing engagement, and to be part of a community of generosity. Yes.
Amen. And let me thank each of you as well for joining in with us this evening. Wish we could be together in a different way, but it's been good to be together in this way. And we'd like you to check out the new podcast series called Relief, Development, and Podcast. It's available wherever you listen to podcasts. This month, particularly Isa Mbolo joins our host, Scott Campbell, to talk about the creation of peace clubs and bringing those into Zambian correctional facilities, as well as his own personal journey to becoming a peace builder. And it's quite a marvelous story. So thanks to each of you for coming this evening. May God guide us and direct us in how we can be centers for generosity and leave our scarcity behind. Blessings. Thank you.